Throughout the Third Age, the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor grew to dominate most of the Westlands, from the River Lune in the west, to the Sea of Rhûn in the east, to Thorkel in the north, to the sands of Harad in the south. But there was one land that the Drúedain never even controlled, let alone settled, despite it being neatly placed between both kingdoms. In this video, we look at the land of Drúwaith Iaur, the mysterious wilderness of the south. If you look at a map of Middle-earth, you will see the small name of Drúwaith Iaur to the west of Gondor, and south of the land of Enedwaith. The land of Drúwaith Iaur roughly corresponds to the lands south of the River Angren, better known as the River Isen, and to the north or west of the White Mountains. As you can see, the land was in relatively close proximity to nations such as Gondor or Rohan, and to peoples such as the Dunlendings, who at least one point had settled beyond the River Adorn. Yet despite this, no one ever claimed Drúwaith Iaur. It remains an untamed wilderness from the Second Age all the way to the Fourth Age. Alright, so what was going on here that meant that somehow no kingdom ever planted a flag in Drúwaith Iaur? Well, there's two reasons for this. The first is how the land is described, a rugged wilderness of dark forests and caves, and combining that with its remoteness, you can see why people didn't really want to live there. Even the Númenórean colonists of the Second Age, despite occupying much of Eriador to the north and Gondor to the west, never actually occupied Drúwaith Iaur. The closest they got was some beacons and a coast guard force that operated out of the nearby Cape of Andrast. Drúwaith Iaur actually receives an indirect reference in the Fellowship of the Ring in regards to its wild, remote nature. After the Fellowship failed the Red Horn Pass, Boromir suggests that the Fellowship could enter Gondor from the west by passing over the River Isen, which would take them through Drúwaith Iaur. Gandalf rejects this idea, saying that such a journey could take as long as a year, and that the lands would be empty and harbourless. Basically, Gandalf is saying that passing through Drúwaith Iaur is a great way to get lost and run out of supplies. But the lands were perhaps not as empty as Gandalf believed, and that brings us to the second reason why no one wanted to settle in Drúwaith Iaur, and that was because of the Drúedain. Yes, Drúwaith Iaur translates to Old Púcal Land, or Púcal Wilderness, Púcal being another name for the Drúedain. If you've forgotten who the Drúedain are, that's the people who help Theoden and the Rohirrim get through the Drúedain forest so that they can relieve the siege of Minas Tirith. By most standards, they are a primitive people, but also capable of strange magic and have knowledge regarding nature that most other men did not. While they could be friendly, they could also be incredibly dangerous and ruthless despite their small stature. Thus, the land had an ill reputation. In the Second Age, when the forests of Enedwaith and Minhiriath were destroyed by the logging of the Númenóreans and later Sauron's invasion of Eriador, the native Gwytherim men refused to flee across the Isen into the similarly wooded lands of Drúwaith Iaur, instead choosing to settle in the rougher lands of Dunlin to the east because of their fear of the Púcal men. Even in the late Third Age, the men of Anfalas in Gondor had legends of Drúedain living in the mountains of Andrast, and it was rare for the men of Gondor or Rohan to even enter Drúwaith Iaur. So even in the late Third Age, the land was a mostly uncharted wilderness. And to be fair, it wasn't wrong for outsiders to be afraid of Drúwaith Iaur. The Drúedain were not a vindictive people. They had once lived among the Halidin in the Forest of Brethil in Beleriand, and some had even lived in Númenor for a time. Above all else, they hated orcs, which is why they were so willing to help King Theoden and the Rohirrim. But at the same time, history hadn't been exactly kind to the Drúedain who lived in the lands that would later become Gondor. They were considered the very first settlers of those lands. Gondorian historians actually believe that they were the first men to cross the Anduin, but over time they were gradually pushed into the fringes of the land by more men coming from the east. These were pre-Númenóreans, related to the Halidin who had once lived with the Drúedain, but many of those ones had entered the service of darkness and did not look kindly upon the Drúedain. By the time of the late Second Age, most of the Drúedain in Gondor had been pushed into the mountains and even beyond them, places like the Drúedain Forest and Drúwaith Iaur. Obviously, they were not friendly to the new inhabitants. We even get a reference to them in Tolkien's strange tale about Tal Elmar. Ironically, those same pre-Númenóreans who pushed the Drúedain into the mountains would then themselves be pushed into the mountains by the actual Númenóreans. Unfortunately, that probably meant the Drúedain became even more reclusive. So you can see why men like the Gwaithrim or the later Gondorians avoided these lands. Even ignoring the fact that they were remote and wild, they were said to be inhabited by men who had been repeatedly wronged by history and weren't afraid of holding on to a grudge. It was made more terrifying by the fact that the Drúedain could emerge from anywhere in the forest or from caves, and that they used poisoned weaponry. The final bit was a good piece of propaganda actually. While the Drúedain did use poisoned weapons, it was only on orcs. They had laws against using them on any other creatures, even men that they despised. So we have all these legends about the Drúedain dwelling in Drúwaith Iaur, the old Pukel land, but were these legends true? Well, while never mentioned in the Lord of the Rings, in a note in the Unfinished Tales, it's said that some of Saruman's forces were driven south in the aftermath of the First Battle of the Forts of Isen. They seem to have been driven fairly far south, perhaps even beyond the River Adorn, because they were said to have been attacked by the Drúedain, who issued forth from caves in the mountains, confirming that, yes, even thousands of years later, the Drúedain still lived in Drúwaith Iaur. Beyond the Third Age, we can only guess what happened to Drúwaith Iaur. Although King Elessar granted the Drúedain forest to the Drúedain, forbidding other men from entering, there's no record of him doing the same when it came to Drúwaith Iaur. The Drúedain forest was technically part of Gondor, whereas Drúwaith Iaur was not, and perhaps Aragorn didn't even know that the Drúedain lived there. But owing to its wild, remote, mysterious nature, you'd have to expect that Drúwaith Iaur stayed untouched for at least a little while longer. After all, there were plenty of other empty lands that could be resettled before any ambitious colonist placed their eyes upon Drúwaith Iaur. You'd have to imagine that many would have remembered the legends of savages living in caves and wielding poisonous weapons, and promptly reconsidered. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. After my video on Forodwaith, I thought it would be a cool idea to do a video on an even more obscure part of Middle-earth's geography. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I will be able to find something more obscure than Drúwaith Iaur, but if you can find a place on the map that you'd like to know more about, please do let me know. Speaking of Drúwaith Iaur, saying that name over and over again was really scary for me, but in the end, it didn't turn out to be that difficult, provided I'm actually pronouncing it right. I couldn't find any proper pronunciations anywhere. I like a lot of Tolkien's names, but that one can go get. Anyway, cheers, farewell, and remember, Drúwaith Iaur?